All right, welcome back to another episode of Building a Family Business here on Builder Funnel Radio. Wes, Brooks, how are you guys today?
Doing great.
Doing awesome, Spence.
Brooks, what's going on out in Seattle, man?
Hey, the big news last week was our city council passed a payroll tax, which taxes companies who make over $7 million a year in revenue. And if you pay someone over 150 grand a year, you're going to pay another 2%. And it's kind of a sliding scale. So really targeting, 7 or 8 really big companies. Amazon is one of them. Google be another one. They're in Seattle. So this just affects incorporated Seattle.
Did you say 7 million or 7 billion?
7 million. So not
Million.
yeah.
So really it would impact a lot of very small companies.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's, and then the scale goes up from 150,000 a year up to, I think if someone made 500,000 a year. So this is going to impact a lot of companies, a lot of tech companies that have high salaries.
So is this replacing before they had attempted to
what they call the Amazon tax?
Right.
We have a city council member who's a socialist, and so she is just tracking after Amazon. And her quote was last week, "Hey Jeff Bezos, we're coming for you and your kind, and we're gonna get you." I mean, so it's very,
Wow.
very aggressive. So it'll be, it's one of those things going to play out, I think, over 20 years. Because the tax goes till 2040.
Whoa.
Now, Brooks, so can this tax be overridden by the mayor or anything like that? I heard it was passed 7-2.
The mayor could veto it, but I think the political winds are such that it's going to go. I mean, it passed 5-2.
5-2.
5-2, which I was stunned. I thought it might have been much closer. But so we'll see. I mean, it's going to be really interesting to.
Did they say what that tax is going to go to?
A certain amount to fund homelessness, a certain amount to fund inclusion, to help work on, balancing things within the city, and then I don't know, 140 million to do something. I don't know.
Isn't that nice? Yeah.
I lost interest. I'm just like, wow, it seems like such a bad idea. I'm fine paying for services to help people, but it's just amazing the way they're choosing to do it. I mean, I think they'll just drive these huge economic engines out of the city.
Yeah. So what do you think? Maybe that's an interesting thing to talk about. What are the unintended consequences of this tax? Do you think that the city council maybe isn't thinking about, or maybe discounting?
I don't think city councils really understand how business people think.
Mm-hmm.
You can be committed to a city. You can be committed to, Denver or, wherever you live as a business owner. But there comes a point where, I'm not appreciated or valued for what I bring in the terms of jobs and to the economy. I'm just going to look at the numbers and say, I'm going to move. And people do, and businesses do. One business, they profiled obviously to show that people would be leaving the city. He's like, I'm moving my whole company to Texas because it's cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty extreme. And he may have a challenge finding qualified talent after he does that. So it's that balance. For us though, people can move their whole businesses to Bellevue or Redmond.
Interesting.
Like open arms. It's just across the bridge. It's 15 minutes away. So I think
it's interesting. It's kind of similar to the impact that sometimes zoning laws will have within a city. So if they have very draconian zoning laws, then all of a sudden the unintended consequences, it forces all the development just right outside the center of the city, and really creates kind of the opposite effect of what the zoning department and the planning department wanted to accomplish. And that, I think, happened down in Portland, correct?
Yeah, they did. Well, growth management ring, they call it, and just pushes everything We'll put it either right inside or right outside, but it can create these, instead of having growth be a little bit, planned holistically all the way through. They just said, oh, well, we'll just put this ring here and that'll solve the problem.
Right. City of Boulder has done, similar things and suffered from that. And certainly by putting a lot of restrictions on growth, kind of the unintended consequences, there's less growth. So the cost of real estate skyrockets, which makes it less likely that people who don't make as much money will be able to live in the city. And so, it just kind of cascades, and you get a lot of adverse effects.
Yeah. One of the things the city of Seattle City Council doesn't figure out is, if you just made it easier to build in your city, you'd have more housing and you would then have more income and things. And so just taxing the very top isn't really getting at the core issue, which is, you're short 6,000 units a year because you can't figure out how to get projects built inexpensively and get them through the system. So it's this disconnect between the market and city planning. You look at, it may happen in your city where you guys are at, which is, uncontrolled growth, unplanned growth is, a 4-lane highway with stoplights and Taco Bell, Dunkin' Donuts, Taco Bell, how and what kind of planning is that? That's not necessarily, and we still see it just replicated today. Again, you're taking the open market, which is, we'll just keep plopping our way down the way. And that doesn't look very good either.
Yeah, it's an interesting problem. I think fundamentally, though, I think the question, it's a difference of viewpoint, which is, where's the control? Mm-hmm. So one group might say, well, we think the market should control what happens. And the other end of the spectrum is, no, we think government should control what happens. And so you see that in your tax policy and in your regulations. So in the sense of, if we think about less expensive housing or more affordable housing or housing for the homeless, it's the question of, okay, who's going to provide that? And is the market going to provide it and take care of those things, or is government going to provide it? And that's where the dollars go, right? Government says, here, give me the dollars, we'll solve it. Right. And the market says, no, we'll keep our dollars and we'll solve it. Yeah. And probably the answer is somewhere in between.
It's somewhere in between, because because the capital will seek a return and the market will seek, how do I make money? And they will do that in conjunction with the government, but both parties have to get there and say, okay, I don't maybe like all your ideas, but we can use some of them, and vice versa.
Right. Yeah. The happy medium.
A happy medium.
You'd think though that, we'd be able to look at certain either cities or towns or, states that have maybe, successfully executed planned growth, blending those two, because it feels like you're just repeating errors across the country in different spots, and that's where I think you have some of the inefficiency in government, is that, there's not that communication, or, if you were looking at it globally, you'd be able to take advantage of some of those hard lessons learned. But to your point too, if you just let capitalism run all the way, then you'll probably see some weird things crop up like this doesn't really, make a whole lot of sense, holistically, or maybe it made sense in this, sector here. So, yeah. So do you think you'll see a big exodus of companies? I was just talking to a remodeler last week, and he's in the Chicago area, and he's like, yeah, I'm thinking about moving down to Tennessee, just pick it up.
I think that you always have to, I would still stay for me in the construction business. I'd stay in the Seattle market because there's demand.
Sure.
So I'll stay where there's business, and I'll, fight it out. A buddy of mine was getting an over-the-counter permit, which is when you walk up and get a permit for something you do over the counter. City of Seattle, it's been a month for something you would get over the counter. And it's just
unreal.
So the trade-offs are, there's work there, there's a job to do, but very complex. And
I think so. The more complex it is, of course, I think
more expensive.
the more expensive and the less competition in the marketplace. Certainly, new companies may choose not to enter into that market, or someone who's just getting started, they go, man, this is too much. It's going to require too much capital, too much time. Whereas the established companies, it kind of plays to them because they understand what has to be done, and they have market share. And so probably interesting enough, I mean, do you guys think that more government regulation in that case stifles competition in the sense that there's fewer competitors?
Yeah, I think it does, but more government regulation just kind of stifles everything. So it just makes it harder. And people will go. I mean, we saw that with Boeing 20 years ago when they moved out of Seattle and they started, building planes in South Carolina and in other places. And that's not a good thing. It would have been better if we kept all that manufacturing here.
Sure.
But Boeing said, hey, we're not going to be held hostage by the state of Washington. So they physically moved their headquarters to Chicago and said, okay, we are a global company. And so they just removed themselves from all the pressure of Washington state. And so now they negotiate with different states. So we lost a big plant that they built in South Carolina, which was just, I think, was foolish.
Yeah.
Maybe,
200 years ago, you wouldn't move your plant because it was next to the river, or 300, 400, it was next to the river, and you needed the power of the water to run your plant. And of course, we're so fluid today. Capital can go anywhere instantaneously. Borders are fairly open and porous, and we can move things around. Certainly within the United States, of course.
Oh yeah,
there's an incredible amount of opportunity to move.
Maybe I've never thought about it this way, but as soon as you guys were talking about it, it just hit me, and maybe this is super obvious and I'm going to embarrass myself here, but I'm thinking about the whole Boeing thing. You said, well, yeah, they just picked up and moved a bunch of manufacturing to another state or a couple other states, we're the United States, but it seems like in this regard, your states are competing to get these big employers and, get people to move, so again, that's another area where you're going, well, if we were looking at this holistically, there's probably a more efficient way to do this, or a better way to do this. Cause I'm sure the moves probably didn't cost them anything.
States competing with each other versus thinking as the United States of America, what's the best way to do that? Yeah. Well, we will see, and hopefully this podcast will be around in 20 years when we see the results of this.
Yeah. We'll do a follow up on the payroll tax.
Note to self.
Yeah. So Wes, what are we even talking about today?
I think we're going to talk about stakeholders, stakeholders versus shareholders, and talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So why are stakeholders? Why is this an important topic? Why did we even want to carve out the time?
Is it an important topic? We don't know. This is our podcast, so we can talk about whatever we want.
Fair.
It's important or not, but I think stakeholders and stakeholder theory is kind of something that's come up over the last, 20 years or so. And typically, when we think about a company, we're thinking about shareholders, right? And maximizing shareholder value. And that's the ultimate goal of any company, is to maximize shareholder value. But there's been, the thought has expanded to say, hey, it's not just the shareholders, there's stakeholders. So you'll hear that now about, oh, well, what about the stakeholders? And you'll hear it in the news, and you'll hear pundits talking about that. But essentially it's, well, who are our stakeholders in a company? Obviously we've got your employees are a stakeholder. Certainly your shareholders are stakeholders. They're very interested in the company, but it could be your customers. It could be your suppliers. It could be society at large is a stakeholder in what the company is doing. The government's a stakeholder, creditors are stakeholders. So there's lots of different stakeholders. And so it's kind of interesting to think about, well, how invested are those stakeholders, and what's the impact of what the company does on those different stakeholders, and what say should they have in what the company is doing.
Yeah, and it's almost like what we were just talking about, with this decision, somebody saying I'm going after Amazon. Well, who are all the stakeholders involved in that decision is, and that's probably more, than they're just thinking about. But yeah, I guess Brooks, as you think about, some of the businesses that you've been over the years, did you ever, I guess, think about stakeholders versus the shareholders, and does that drive your decision making, or
Well, it does. When you're talking, you have internal stakeholders, external stakeholders. Internal stakeholders being employees, owners, managers, people like that who are right in the company who are deriving benefit or causing things to happen. And then your external, like Wes was saying, your external stakeholders are creditors, shareholders, banks, government, things like that. So as we, over time, I probably thought mostly about, well, how did I think about it as the owner? And then that drove some of my decision making, and then thinking about, well, what are the employees? How is this going to react to, how are the employees going to react to some of these decisions, and how are some of the customers going to react? How's that going to affect the business? So it's interesting to try to figure that out, because you'll try to figure out, well, how will all the employees think about this, and then be totally wrong. It's like,
Yeah, I mean, certainly as you talk more about, can stakeholders all have a place at the table, so to speak, and have input. And I guess I have mixed feelings about that. So obviously if you're a shareholder, and a shareholder is just another word for owner, right? If you're an owner, ultimately I kind of think about the shareholder or the owner. It's the old chicken and the pig at breakfast, right? The chicken is interested, the pig's invested, and because he's the ham and the bacon, and the chicken's going to show up again tomorrow for breakfast, and he's going to be interested. But to me, most stakeholders are falling in the chicken category, and the owners are the pig category, and that they're invested. If things don't go well, they're out of business, and it has a huge impact on them. But I think it kind of goes back maybe to what we were talking about earlier, in the sense of some form of balance. If you think about Flint, Michigan, for instance, where they had the huge problem with water contamination. I forget the company that was contaminating it, but the whole water supply was contaminated by a pretty large company. And so in that case, in this case, society at large was definitely a stakeholder in that company, in the sense that they had a vested interest in having clean water. And so the company was obviously ignoring them as a stakeholder. And they were going, no, we're just, if our whole goal is to maximize shareholder value, then we don't care about these other stakeholders. And so you can have some bad effects. And we certainly have seen that, early on in the Industrial Revolution, in terms of pollution and other bad effects.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because it's these I guess unintended consequences that you mentioned earlier. You're going down a path, and you're making decisions based on what you feel like is, in this case, hey, we're appealing to shareholders, people that are owners, or the livelihood of the business. But as you start looking at ripple effects of decision making and how big your company footprint is, I always think about, in terms of my team here, we have a very small footprint in the grand scheme of things, but everyone here that works for me, like that ripple effect, like what we do, what decisions we make impacts their families, and their lives, and what their decisions that they're trying to make. And so yeah, it does seem like there is a balance, and I don't know, it's fairly complex when you start to get into it, and you go, well, how should you make these decisions? Because if you make all the decisions just for the pig, then maybe the chickens all run off because they're like, well, this is no fun,
Well, yeah, or they can get a little upset. I mean, if you start thinking through your different stakeholders, as I was thinking about this a little bit earlier, I was trying to just identify what each stakeholder has, what their interest in that company is and that company's activities, So, so what's government's interest in what's their stake in the company? What do they get out of a successful company?
They get tax revenue.
Taxes, right? Yeah, they get tax revenue. Yeah, for
They get
sure.
employment, which drives taxes. They get B&O tax. They get income tax. So
Yeah. So they do have a vested interest in the company doing well in order to get taxes. And I think if you think about the pandemic, that we've been kind of experiencing right now, what's been happening to local governments that have been hammered by lost tax revenue because restaurants and companies have shut down and, sales tax has gone way down and on and on and on. So it definitely, for them, having taxes and be able to run the infrastructure they have a big investment or certainly an interest in making sure that companies are doing well and want to stick around, right? They want to stick around.
That doesn't translate unfortunately, to the actions of government, which would be, we need to make things easier to do business here so we can make it easier for people to operate. We're doing a project right now. We've been trying to get approvals for 2 years. Should be something relatively simple because it's just a reapproval, and 2 years to get the approval, which means we can't build 100 units until we get the approval, which would provide more jobs, provide more taxes, provide more.
Right.
So that's a pretty clear example. If you have a stakeholder who has an interest but doesn't be able to
doesn't connect the dots. Doesn't connect all the dots. Yeah. And I was sorry. Oh, I was just as I was thinking through though, I mean, creditors, they have an interest in the company. They want to be repaid. They want to make their fees. Customers, well, they're obviously a stakeholder because if they're getting, I was thinking about the B2B situation. Like, if you're a remodeler or a builder and you're a customer of a, lumber yard and the lumber yard fails, now you've got a problem, right? And the same flips around for the supplier, right? If the supplier of his ultimate user of, the lumber, if the remodeler goes out of business, he's got a problem. So, everyone's got that. Everyone has a stake in everything else in some way.
Yeah. As you were talking about the government maybe not always connecting the dots, it seems like do you feel like government in general just maybe doesn't have that growth mindset? Because the couple examples you just laid out, you make it easier for businesses. They want to come there. They're going to grow. You make it easier for them to grow. Like their pie gets bigger too, and everybody's winning, and there's more to go around. There's more to help, certain causes and put it towards like, homeless shelters and some of the examples we used earlier. So do you think that's part of what it is, or is it just not always aligned interests? It's because it seems like a lot of the interests would be aligned.
Well, I think generally government is interested in growing, because it's made up of people just like anything. And so people are interested in job security and, more structure around and more, all of that. So more government, I think for most governments are very interested in self-perpetuating themselves and growing bigger. And I think it's also a viewpoint that they can do more to help maybe than general industry. So that is the mindset. But I think they can see growth is happening. They don't necessarily, I don't think, see that as the company grows, they grow. They can simply say, we are an entity in and of ourselves, and we're going to extract more taxes, or, we're going to do whatever we have to do to maintain what we have going forward. And that just may mean that companies have to give more, or people have to give more to maintain this. And So you certainly see that in Europe, right, where you have countries that have very high tax rates and the government provides a lot of stuff, but it relies on those people to pay those taxes.
Well, it's interesting. I've been in meetings with, so it'd be governments, stakeholders, and you're explaining to them what you're trying to accomplish, and you recognize that you have not done a good job of educating people about how business works or how the process works, because you're sitting there talking to people and to planners, and you realize, I have not done a good job of explaining how the economics of this process and product works, so they can understand what the challenges are to try to get to the finished product, which is what they're interested in, which is housing, which is the business we're in. But it could be any kind of service and that's not their training. And so I think this happened a couple of years ago, and I'm just like, I should really have done more around, explaining, hey, these are all the different market forces we're up against, and saying we're glad to take on those challenges, but this is where we need to help, from the government, so that we can try to navigate, all the risk. So that's probably part of that, bringing people together, bringing stakeholders together, is helping educating all the stakeholders. Okay, here's what these different stakeholders are concerned about, and at least that's where you get probably more people in a common space. Like, okay, that works. It's not ideal, but it works.
Well, you certainly see that in planning departments. I remember early on when I was, Brooks and I were just starting to build houses and so on, and worked in a pretty small town. And the planning department was made up of some very, very young planners, probably, our age or a little bit younger. And what you soon found out was that young planners who don't have a lot of life experience don't have that economic lens. So, if you let's say you go into a building department and you talk to someone who's been in that building department for a long time, like a plan checker or someone, if they've been through some economic cycles up and down, they know that their paycheck is paid by fees that are for building permits. And so they know that, hey, I do need to move building permits through at some rate in order to keep my job. And if the economy tanks and no one's getting building permits, no more raises, things have to be cut back eventually. So I found that the younger folks in the government side were less flexible.
Yeah, that's interesting. That whole education piece got me thinking about, as people are thinking about their own businesses, you've got the shareholders and the stakeholders, but everyone that you're impacting, if everyone's kind of clear around their goals and outcomes, and you're sharing that, that information, you're educating on how the process works and how somebody's goals, if they achieve those, it helps the other person achieve their goals. But then you can start to find those, I guess, synergies. I hate to use that word because it gets thrown around a lot, but you can find the common ground of how you can move forward in a way that's moving shareholders and stakeholders closer to their goal. And kind of want to pivot a little bit to talk about how family maybe changes up the dynamic, if it does or doesn't. What have you guys found there, Brooks, over the years? Does having a family member as either a shareholder or a stakeholder, does it look different with it being family versus non-family?
A shareholder is a stakeholder. So when a family member is a shareholder, they're a stakeholder. They could be a family member could be an employee, so they're a stakeholder. They could be a shareholder, which they have ownership. And those are kind of typically the two spots that family members would sit. So I think you still have to be, there's more complexity because that family member might have more impact, or you're going to impact them more by decisions you make, or it's going to be you're impacting a family member. Whereas if you're if you have an employee who's not a family member and you have to terminate them or lay them off because the economy's slow, that's unfortunate, but they're not a family member that you're going to see at Christmas, most likely. So it's a different relationship. But I think that's where the challenges come, when a family member is a stakeholder.
Yeah, I think a family member, they don't even have to be, like maybe you're saying, Brooks, they don't have to be a shareholder. They don't have to be an employee really to be a stakeholder in that business, because it is part of the family dynamic. So certainly a child who's growing up can be a stakeholder in that company,
Yep.
even though they don't have any ownership and any of that, because what's going on in that company definitely impacts them. Or it could be a sibling maybe who's not involved in the company, but they think that someday that they may be involved with that or have some piece of that, or, so they also become a stakeholder and have an interest in that company. Once again, maybe more in the chicken category than the pig category, but certainly has an impact on everyone's day-to-day lives.
I think with stakeholders, it just brings up the idea that communicate, and so your level of communication depends on how important you feel that relationship is with that stakeholder. Let's say you have vendors and you have 3 plumbing vendors. Well, you might communicate to a certain level with them because you have 3, whereas if you only have 1 plumbing vendor, you might communicate a lot more because you really need that 1 plumbing vendor. So it goes back to probably layers of risk as a business owner. And so you may need to communicate much more with a family member who could be, as Wes described, could be a child, it could be a sibling, just because you're committed to that relationship. Because, you can pick your friends, but you can't pick your family members.
Yeah, right. I like your point about communication. And Brooks, as you were talking about that, it made me think about a time, when Dad was back in the early 70s, we had the Boeing crash, and he definitely had just started a housing development, was really struggling with that because all of a sudden the sales dried up just as he launched. And so he had a bunch of suppliers, lumber suppliers and plumbers and everything like that, where, they all needed to get paid. And he was struggling to make those payments. And so, you have 2 choices with your stakeholders. You can either shut them out and not communicate, or you can communicate heavily, like Brooks was talking about, and work out some good solutions. So in this case, Dad did a ton of communicating with his stakeholders. So in that case, it'd be the creditors, the suppliers, with customers. And by doing that communication, he was able to work out a solution for really kind of a tough dig out of that spot, because the economy just totally tanked at that time. So I think communication with your stakeholders is critical, as Brooks was bringing up.
The interesting to talk about that, Wes, is that not all of us want to be communicators. Some of us may be naturally want to communicate, and some people may not want to naturally communicate. So that's the thing to look at. Ask yourself that question, which is, am I a good communicator? Am I a bad communicator? When things get tough, do I just, close up, don't want to talk to people, and think strategically about, how do I want to communicate to my stakeholders?
Yeah. And if you don't communicate with them, that is a communication.
That's right.
So, and they're going to fill in the blank for whatever you are not communicating. And I think when we realize that, we go, oh, I would much rather shape that message and have that dialogue with that particular stakeholder to achieve a better outcome. So, as business owners, we have to be good communicators and think about how we're having that interaction with our stakeholders. I think one thing, now, when I think about now, how I would think about business versus 30 years ago, I think it's pretty tunnel vision, or, very much just thinking about what used to be the typical stakeholder, which was the shareholder or the owner, me, myself, and I. And now I think it is kind of good to run down the list as you think about decisions that you make as a business owner and go, okay, well, I'm making this decision. I think about how it impacts my employees and how it impacts me and maybe how it impacts my family. But yeah, how does it impact my suppliers? How does it impact my customers, my creditors, society at large? All those types of things. It's worthwhile to take could be 15 minutes, could be 10 minutes, just to kind of rip down through that list and think, okay, any unintended consequences that are going to come from this decision that I'm making. I think it just helps us get us a better, well-rounded decision-making process.
Yeah, how does that play out? Is that just kind of some what ifs? Because I think this whole
Yeah.
idea of the unintended consequences is a good one, because oftentimes, yeah, you only looked at a couple components, or you had to act quickly, so you just went, great, this seems good on the surface, and then you get a couple weeks or a couple months down the road and you go, oh, I didn't think about that. So is there a good process, or is it just kind of a part of just saying, okay, if I do this, and then just trying to walk through the steps and see how it plays out?
Yeah, I think that's been, you can't see the future and you can't read other people's minds. So simply just by ripping down through the list and just saying, okay, have I at least given this some cursory thought here, instead of just, some of us are more prone to action than others. Some people are very much knee jerk and make decisions immediately. Some people are tortured over making decisions. Um, but but eventually, I think just making sure you've thought it all the way through, through the entire list of folks.
You might, yeah, it might be, if you have that list of stakeholders, you
Yeah.
maybe some that you pick up the phone and call. You say, hey, I'm thinking about making this, making a decision here. What would you, any feedback, and that might be depending on their level of interest in the business. Your lender, if you're a lender, if you're pretty heavy into your lender, then he might be pretty interested, and you'd want to have his support for maybe some move you're making either direction. Um,
Yeah, make them, we haven't talked about it here, but certainly we've had discussions about mastermind groups and having um, key people at the table to help you run your business and get their input. And so if you have a close relationship with a supplier, close relationship with a customer or past customer, a lender, if you can get those people in to help you think through some of those things on a regular basis, awesome. That's
that's a
great.
good way to do it. Yeah, that's a
Yeah. Take them all, just meet for breakfast once a month or once a quarter, something, get that input.
Yeah, because you still call the final shot, but then that
Sure.
exposes you to the new ideas and the things that maybe you didn't see and think about. I was actually just talking to a friend of mine, Todd DeWalt, and he been in construction for a long time and now coaches construction business owners. But we were talking about that same concept of kind of like pushing decision making down, and the person that is at the level of the work usually can identify problems or
oh yeah.
issues in a schedule or thing, much better, which makes total sense. But a lot of times when you're making decisions at the top, you forget about that or you skip that step. And so just getting that little bit of input, can save you from making a bad move.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Go talk to the person who's actually going to do it.
Yeah. So on this whole topic of shareholders, stakeholders, what else do people need to be thinking about? We've kind of talked about how maybe the family dynamic changes it a little bit, and it's a good way to maybe make better decisions, or at least have just thought through the impact of the decision, so you kind of know what you're dealing with. But Brooks, anything else that we should add to this?
As you're thinking about your stakeholders and you're thinking about family members who are stakeholders, it's remembering that there's a lot more emotional energy that those family members bring as stakeholders because they have more invested, whether they're your children or a parent or a sibling. There's just more emotional energy around it. I can't, probably there's a better description for it, but
I think that's pretty good.
Where a banker is going to be like, yeah, that's interesting, but I've got 200 other clients, and if this doesn't work out, it's not the end of the world. Where it's just an interesting dynamic. There's more something you'd think as a business owner. Oh, well, I'm going to talk to another minority partner who happens to be a sibling or a child, or and think, oh, this isn't going to be a big deal. And there's just more energy around it because there's just more family energy. So I think it's important to recognize that and try to move through that, and recognize it may take a little bit more talking and time than it would with someone that you're not related to.
Yeah, I think that's a good point about the time. Just allow enough time and know your stakeholders, right? I mean, know their personalities as much as you can. Obviously, society at large, you're not going to know society at large's personality.
That'd be tough to nail down.
Multiple personality disorder, society at large. But certainly, your family members. So, some people can't make decisions quickly, or they need to think things through. Then you need to allow enough time for that.
Yeah.
Sure.
That makes sense. Well, hopefully this has given you guys some food for thought. I don't know that we solved any world problems today, but
probably zero.
Certainly, yeah. It hopefully expanded some thinking and just made you think about some things within your own business and your own world. And as always, we appreciate you guys listening. Let us know if you have any topics or random things you want us to riff on and talk about. But we appreciate you listening, and we'll see you next week on Builder Funnel Radio.